Alright, so welcome back to the second video on the anatomy of a research paper. In the previous video I introduced you to the hourglass model of a research paper. Now in this video I would like to dissect an example of an article where this hourglass model is very well applied. And I will do this by looking at an article that you read in your Good Life course by Kathleen Gabriels and her colleague Tanja Moerenhout. So this is a very excellent example of how the hourglass was applied in a scientific report. So you can see already here at the left hand side there are the sections that I mentioned in the previous video. There is an introduction, a method section, a results section and a discussion. Now you might say, well, there is no literature review and there is no current study and there is no conclusion. But they are there. The authors had to be efficient with the word count, and so what they did is they integrated the literature review and their current study in the introduction, and their discussion has a very heavy tail with a few concluding remarks. So this hourglass model of an academic paper is still present, and I will show you as we walk through the paper. Now you can see that this abstract is already structured according to this hourglass model. So we start very broad with a background, and then we go a little bit more concrete through the objectives, and then very specific in the method. Then we go back to our results, and our conclusion is very broad again. Now let's look at the concrete article. So in our introduction we start very broad and with one sentence setting the scene of this article. So today we have many possibilities to track and manage personal health data. So it's about tracking and managing health data in today's society. So here we have the broad and societal and academic context of the research that we're doing here. Also, we are introduced to a theoretical framework, more specifically the quantified self here, already in the first sentence. So we have a broad academic, societal, and theoretical setting the scene in the first few sentences of this article. If we go further, we narrow our focus a little bit down. So here we are introduced to specifically digital technologies or mobile technologies for health management or for the management of personal health data. In the next section, we are talking about the classic self-tracking methods. And we can give even a concrete definition in our literature review. If we go along, we get a little bit more concrete still. So we're talking about the self-management of health data in the context of a disease. And another concept introduced here in the literature review is self-tracking through the eyes of the physician. Also, what we can do here is what we look at is different theoretical concepts also that are here exposed to us through the literature review, which is the context of the medical context and the preventive care or the therapeutic care of personal health data and health tracking. So here we have a broad introduction, a very broad setting the scene, tracking and management of personal health data. We're using a theoretical framework of the quantified self. And then we have digital tracking, classical self-tracking, the context of disease, the perspective of the physician. And then we have preventative care and therapeutic care. So here we are. In a few sentences, we have been introduced from a very broad theme to several theoretical concepts that we can now start to study. Because the next paragraph is this paper has a twofold objective. So here you see that we're now in the current study section. Even though they don't name this paragraph or section as such, it is an introduction of the current study. It says this paper has. So now we know what we're talking about here. And there's two objectives. Number 1 and number 2. And in between these two objectives, we also are introduced to a concrete research question. So how are general practitioners and cardiologists, how do they incorporate self-tracking in their daily clinical practice? So this is a clear example of the current study section and how it is derived from the previous literature review and the introduction. There's two things here that I would like you to note, is that in the introduction or the literature review, there are indeed mentions of previous works. They're all colored red here. So you see that that Kathleen and her colleague really show the broader academic dialogue that they are part of with this research. Also, you can see that each paragraph really contains one idea, one concept. Writing a paragraph is also something that is rather difficult. So in a separate video, John Harbert will give you a concrete explanation on how to structure and how to write a good paragraph. What model do we use there in order to make a paragraph sticky? So definitely check out that video too. Alright, so now we're introduced to the current study, the current research questions, and then we get even a little bit more concrete here. So what do we understand with classical self-tracking and what do we understand with digital self-tracking? Now we move on to the methods section. So in the methods section, we have three things that we discussed. How were our data gathered, how were our data analyzed, and how were our data measured. So here you can see we start with the sample selection. So where the study here uses a purposive, convenience-based sample. Also, what were the inclusion or exclusion criteria? Well, doctors with relevant experience with classical self-tracking methods. Additionally, one of the authors is a general practitioner herself, and she used snowball sampling in order to facilitate the recruiting process. So here we get a very detailed explanation on how the data were gathered. Who are our participants and how were they sampled? We also get introduced to when did we stop collecting data? Well, at a point of theoretical saturation, which was obtained after 7 interviews. At the end of this part, they also discuss the ethical protocols behind the study. So in this case, the study was reviewed by the Institutional Review Board from the Free University of Brussels in this case. And you can also see that the authors here asked all participants to sign an informed consent form. This consent form is added in the appendix. Then, how were our data measured? Well, also this is here in our method section in the interview guide. So what did the authors do specifically? Well, they did semi-structured interviews. Also, these interviews had 2 sections. In the first section, they discussed these 5 topics. And in the second section, there were these 3 topics. These topic lists are actually also in the appendix. So here you get a very concrete idea of how the data were measured. What was the instrument, the interview instrument that was used? Then they also say, well, even though we had 2 types of interviewees, general practitioners and cardiologists, basically our interview guide was the same, except for the case that in the interviews with the cardiologists, we changed our interview guide a little bit more to the practice of internal medicine. So then our third step in the method section is how were the data analyzed? And also this is very detailed described in this study. So we see that first of all interviews were transcribed ad verbatim, so that means in a very literal sense. And then the authors did a thematic analysis. And they, in order to give you even a better insight into the kitchen, they explained that this procedure for analyzing the data took 3 phases. In the first phase, the 2 authors went through the transcripts in order to reach consensus of the types of codes. So this is the first inductive approach. What they also did is they created a coding scheme, partly driven by the concepts identified in the literature review, in order to do also a deductive analysis. Both these coding schemes is also in the appendix, so you can look that up. In the second phase, they looked at these codes at a higher level of abstraction. So they looked at the deeper themes behind these codes. And in the third phase, they went a little bit higher still and tried to link these themes to concepts, to theoretical concepts. And with that, they also tried to link it back to the academic literature. And what they also describe here, so this is all in the context of replicability, is how did they assure quality, reliability, and validity of the research? Well, they did that through member validation, which means that they ran their interviews by their interviewees and to see whether their interpretations do indeed hold water in what these interviewees meant. So then the authors here give us a very concrete discussion of how the sample is, what the characteristics of a sample are. Well, first of all, the participants took between 38 minutes and 105 minutes in order to be interviewed. And then we get also a table with the key characteristics of our 12 participants. Sometimes it can be important also to give the national or cultural context in which this study was done. In this case, the healthcare system in Belgium might be very specific, and so this study can maybe say something only about the Belgian context and nothing about the Dutch context or German context or English context. So this was a very, very detailed description of our data. How did we gather it, how did we measure it, and how did we analyze it? Now we are going to the results section. In the results section, as I also discussed in my previous video, this is a very dry section. All we do here is presenting the reader with our findings. So the authors also do that here. They say this very dry, boom, first sentence, 4 major themes arose from the data. This team 1, team 2, team 3, and team 4. And then they go into these themes a little bit more in detail. So what does this team exactly mean and how did we get to this team? And then they provide evidence from their own data. So here they display or they demonstrate why this theme is justified by their data. So in a quantitative study, this is where you would include, for example, a table of a regression model. This is something that I discussed in a previous video. So you have here several quotes are used in order to demonstrate why this theme came out from the data. Not all data is there, it's just some quotes to corroborate this theme. For the second theme, the same. It's the description of what this theme is, and then we have quote from interviewee 1 and quote from interviewee 2 in order to either contrast them or to show that they are both in the same direction. And then we have a third quote, and this is for all the themes here. Also note that in this section, there's basically nowhere a reference to previous work. There is sometimes here and there, but it's mainly a dry description of our data, of this current study's data. Now, after we've did this description, so this is no interpretation yet, we go to the discussion section. In the discussion section, we're bridging the themes of our study with the literature. So here you can see that several extra questions are asked on the basis of our data. So what does this data mean in the broader academic conversation that we are that we grounded our study in? Well, so this is exactly what Kathleen and her colleague do here. And here you suddenly see boom, 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 boom. There are several references again. So here you see in the discussion, you are again broadening up and linking your own data with the previous literature review that you did and with the broader academic conversation that you are part of. All right, so these are the concepts that then are on a higher level of abstraction are interpreted on the basis of this current study. So the professionalization of self-care, no one size fits all, impact on patient-provider relationship, and so on. And then we come at the section that is normally separate, that could be a separate section, is the concluding remarks. So we have here the limitations of the study. So where in our limitations, we ask ourselves the question, where could we possibly be wrong? What are the shortcomings of this research? Well, in this case, they name 3. First, we have a very broad theme. Second, we have a relatively small sample. And third, we studied only physicians and not the viewpoints of the patients. In the last sentence here, they discuss how their best practices of how to mitigate those shortcomings. What did they do in order to try to minimize the impact or the consequences of those shortcomings on the data? And then we have the concluding remarks. So we have in the first paragraph here, we have a short summary of the study, what it was, what it did, and what the results are. And then it says there are some interesting opportunities for future studies. So something for future studies. So what are the implications of our study academically, but also societally? And for example, there could be a focus more on the patient manager side of the study. Or maybe we need a quantitative questionnaire in order to investigate whether these findings also hold water across different nationalities or cultures or contexts and so on. And finally, we have one sentence in which we broaden up again and in which we tie this research in a very broad academic and societal context. These are the concrete implications for the medicalization of health and the professionalization of self-care. So here you see we're now at the broadest part again of this narrative, and we walked through these 7 sections or 7 steps of the hourglass model. Now, I hope that this video helped you in understanding the hourglass model of a research paper, and I hope it helps you writing a good research paper yourself as well. Thank you for watching, and good luck with your studies and your research project.